Well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Help Not Harm Summit. If you're just now joining, this session is what they're not telling you about the transgender movement. You know, many of us here today, we've been hearing all throughout the day about medical concerns with the transgender movement, about political angles, and these are things that hopefully you've been learning more about throughout the day. But today we're going to delve into some things that are not talked about as much. And I have two experts here to join me to talk about that today. So the first one is Dr. Jennifer Bowens from Family Research Council. Dr. Bowens serves as director of the Center for Family Studies at Family Research Council. And in her role, she researches and advocates for policies that will best serve the health and well-being of families and communities. She has a PhD from New York University, and she's worked extensively as a clinician providing trauma-focused treatment to children in foster care and behavioral health settings and to adults who've experienced interpersonal traumas such as sexual abuse and assault. She's also taught on psychological trauma in several graduate programs, including Rutgers University and Princeton Seminary. We're really excited to have you here. Our second guest is Mary Hassan of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Mary Rice Hassan is the Katie O'Byrne Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. She is co-founder and director of the Person and Identity Project, and she leads the Catholic Women's Forum, which is a network of Catholic professional women and scholars amplifying the voices of women in support of Catholic teachings. She's an attorney and policy expert, and so she advises legislators in faith-based organizations, writes for various publications, speaks at national conferences and universities, and she's a frequent media commentator. We are so excited to have you both here today. And these two women, I think, are going to bring a lot of insight into the things you don't hear so much about the transgender movement and offering kind of a principled perspective on these issues. Just as a reminder to our audience, as they're sharing, feel free to comment, share your questions. If your question isn't being addressed during the session, hopefully we're answering it in the comments or storing it away for use in a future video. We really do want to answer those questions for you. So stay engaged. We're really excited about this. But with that, I'm going to hand things over to Mary to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm so glad you're here too, because this is one of the critical issues of our time. And when I think about what's going on in the culture in terms of the transgender movement and gender identity and all of this, I think we hear a lot of happy talk. And we see stories about young children, teenagers who are coming out, embracing their true selves, living a life of authenticity, and as long as everyone else affirms them, they can live happily ever after, and that any problems are really due to stigma and discrimination. But I want to suggest to you that there's another side of the story that we really need to understand because it's affecting all of us. So when I go around and speak about this issue, I talk to families, I talk to young people all the time, and there is a lot of hurt and pain around this issue. And it's not recognized by the culture. But I think we need to understand why. We can have compassion for the individual who's going through a struggle, perhaps, to figure out that big question in life of who am I? Because once you figure that out, then you can answer the other big questions of life. You know, what am I here for? What's good? What's evil? How should I live? We need to understand who we are. So one of the big problems in our culture today, the culture that's permeated by gender ideology, is that the culture is selling us a different vision of the human person. So we have to understand who we are, and we have to be able to convey that truth with conviction, with facts, with kindness to people we meet, because the culture is so strong that people are forgetting the truth about who we are. So let me just go through a couple of key things that I think really help when you're talking to people. One, think back to your history, think back to growing up. There's certain things we know about ourselves, certain things that for millennia people understood about the human person. Our body feels something about who we are. We know we're creatures, we're in relation to God who made us. We look at our bodies and we are our bodies. We're a unity of body and soul. We know that we're made male and female. And when we look at the design of our bodies, we can see that male and female were made for one another, and it's from that we get the family. These truths are part of who we are. We know them intrinsically, but science tells us more about who we are. It tells us that yes, indeed, sex is binary. Don't pay attention to anything you see out there on social media or otherwise that will try to tell you that no, sex is not binary. Sex is binary. How do we know? Sex is the organism's whole body organization towards a reproductive role. There is no human person on this earth who was born of anything other than the union of a male and female. So sex is binary. And what else do we know? We know that there are differences between males and females. And these differences are good. They're good things. So science can tell us a lot. And I'm not talking about stereotypes here, because sometimes when people talk about the differences between males and females, they start thinking about stereotypes. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about science that can look and map the connections in the brain, and that can see, as one study in 2019 did, it can see the difference in patterns between the unborn male child's brain and the unborn female child's brain. These are amazing things. We're so much alike, males and females, but we are different, and those differences matter. So it's important that we affirm the dignity and the equality of each of us, male and female, and yet acknowledge that those differences are real. So what else do we know? We know that within those two categories of male and female, there's a wide variation about who we are, our personalities, our traits. And when I was growing up, people were throwing off all the stereotypes, and feminism had been out in the culture for a while, and people would say, you have a girl, so don't presume that she must like pink, and she's got to wear dresses, and she's got to do all these stereotypical things. Well, what we're seeing with gender ideology is sort of a reversal, where the culture looks at someone's stereotypical behavior or their inclinations, and it says, well, that means you must be a boy or a girl. And that's just not true. So let me contrast the difference between the human person, the truth about the human person, and what gender ideology tells us. So gender ideology has a completely different vision of the person. And this is something we really have to understand, because how we understand who we are is going to affect everything else about the decisions we make, how we live, how we understand what's good in our culture and what isn't. It's anthropology. Anthropology matters. So gender ideology proposes a version of the person that says, instead of the person being their body, I am male, I am female, rather we're composed of these different dimensions. We have a gender identity and a gender expression. We have a sex assigned at birth, and we have anatomy, and we have sexual orientation and romantic orientation. So you can see figures that are out there on the internet, and we'll probably share one here too, that shows a genderbread person, or sometimes a unicorn, a gender unicorn. And there are these figures that have these different parts. But the key thing about gender ideology is it says none of these aspects of who we are have to align. That we as human beings get to self-define. We get to decide what our expression is going to be, what our body should be, what our identity is. And in fact, according to gender ideology, the most distinctive thing about you and me, about who we are, is our gender identity. Now that's kind of a fancy word, right? We're all used to hearing it now, but you know what it means? It means self-perception. It means a person's feeling about who they are. And you can't measure it. You can't test for it. You can't image it. You can't prove it's there. It's a feeling. But gender ideology says that's the most important thing about who we are. And that our sense of who we are, our self-perception, overrides even the reality of our sexed body. That's why you hear things in the culture that will say something like trans women are women, where a male who identifies as a woman is supposed to be treated as a woman. But it's just not true. So neither is the phrase sex assigned at birth. So gender ideology will tell us that our bodies are they're canvases, they're tools for personal expression, but that's not true either. Our bodies are intrinsic to who we are. So our sex is created from the moment of conception. It's not a label that someone sticks on our bodies and we can peel off and choose a different one. That's what children's books these days tell children how to understand their sex to be, that it's simply assigned, but only they know who they are. Only they know for sure. So gender ideology is radically different because it says the person self-defines who they are. And the person then, once they go with their feelings and declare an identity, regardless of the body, should be free to modify the body however they want. And further, they should be able to tell others how they need to relate to them, to dictate reality, to dictate a narrative to everyone else. And so that's the first and most important thing to understand about what we're seeing in the culture today, that this is a worldview that's being presented as the truth. And it's not. It runs completely contradictory to the truth about who we are as human beings, male or female. But we need to know some other things too, that it's not accidental that it feels like our culture is being flooded with all of this gender ideology, because there's a determined campaign to push gender ideology through the culture, through business, through school, through medicine, and principally through social media. And our kids are so vulnerable, particularly with social media, but also through education. And we need to be on guard here because unfortunately today, under this administration, the administration is pushing a definition of who we are, not as sex, male and female, but rather as that undefined self-perception, that gender identity. Even the youngest children are being taught this in our schools. So we have to be attentive to what they're learning. We have to look at the curriculum. We have to take them out if that's what they need, because there are no do-overs on childhood. So we see it in the schools, we see it in medicine, and we see it principally in social media, and it's having an impact. So the latest figures from Gallup said that about 16% of young people identify as LGBTQ. And a recent study from Pittsburgh of high schoolers found that almost 10% of them are identifying as transgender or gender diverse. And that starts them on a pathway towards real harm. So we need to understand these cultural impacts are real. It's like a tsunami coming and just flooding our shores, and we need to protect our children. So what do? How do we get the truth out? I think first we have to know the truth, understand who we are, have confidence in that, be bold, speak the truth, share the truth. Because if there's one thing we can agree on, it's that we all want to help and not harm, particularly towards the most vulnerable. So be part of the solution. Let's help and not harm.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Mary, for sharing those thoughts. You know, I think that's something that we don't think about often enough. We think about the real immediate practical effects of the transgender movement that are right in front of us. And of course, that's the urgent thing that we need to take care of, as you talked about. But we don't think about what this is actually doing to our perception of the human person as well. And I'm just really grateful that you are bringing attention to that. If you aren't, to our audience, if you're not already familiar with the Ethics and Public Policy Center and the Person and Identity Project, we really encourage you to get involved there. We'll put the link in the comments so you can learn more. Mary's done a lot of really great videos addressing some specific issues within the transgender movement. So make sure you take a look at that. I actually want to turn now to Dr. Bowens, who's going to share with us just some more principle-based concerns, but actually drawing on her background in the science and academic world, and sharing with us some of the ethical concerns that we might not be aware of in the transgender movement. So, Dr. Bowens.
That you're doing this event and highlighting some of these issues that aren't talked about as much. I think oftentimes when we talk about the transgender movement, we talk about the horrors of the physiological interventions, and I say interventions loosely, And we don't talk about how a child or how a person gets to the place of actually experiencing some of these medical practices that are so harmful to the body. So what I want to do today is kind of take a step back and take a look at how does this happen? How does a person onboard to these really horrible physiological issues, or interventions rather, and what are the ethical issues that surround the transgender ideology? And to do that, I want to bring in something that's known for researchers and also for practitioners, psychological practitioners. And I'm going to use what was referred to as the Belmont Report. This report outlined 3 ethical principles from 1979, and it was the result of a research act that was passed in 1974 that recognized from the Nuremberg trials that we had some problems with how we were treating research subjects. And so the 3 ethical principles that I'm going to present today highlight the need for oversight for research. But not only for research, but for how we engage in clinical practice, particularly psychological practice. So if you, okay, you have the slide up, you'll see these 3 principles. And the first one is referred to as respect. And this principle highlights the idea that a person has a right to self-determination if they are capable of making their own decisions. And that their decision is truly voluntary. In other words, they are fully informed and capable to make that decision. The next principle that we'll talk about is beneficence, which carries this idea that if we're going to engage in research or if we're going to engage in clinical practice, that the benefits of engaging in that intervention or engaging in that research actually outweigh the risks involved in engaging in the research. So here, the principle of do no harm is underscored. And then last, we'll talk about justice. And justice carries this idea that all research participants, if it's in a practice setting, that everyone is treated with equity, that the distribution of that care happens with fairness. And most importantly, which I want to talk about the most, is that care or that research is done in a non-exploitative way. Next slide, please. So I'm going to apply these 3 principles, which, by the way, should be involved in every research study that we hear about that involves human subjects. And I want to turn to the idea of gender dysphoria and how are these principles applied to a diagnosis and ultimately the treatment of gender dysphoria. But before I do that, I think it's important that we're all on the same page in terms of what is gender dysphoria. We hear it all over the place. We hear about gender ideology, but what does it actually look like in a clinical context? So you can see here on the slide, DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. As of 2013, then DSM-5 put this diagnosis in the manual. And what it outlines is this basic premise that gender dysphoria in children, specifically in children, is marked by an incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and assigned gender. Now, as Mary pointed out, we believe in biological sex, that there is no such thing as gender. But again, I'm quoting the DSM, so this is not my theory. But those symptoms need to be present for 6 months and manifested with at least 6 criteria that I'm about to show you. The important thing that I want to make here is our ethical issues begin starting with the very criteria for gender dysphoria. Interestingly, when you look at gender dysphoria in reference to other diagnoses in the manual, in the DSM manual, you'll see that there's a recognition that that you don't give a diagnosis that requires a more stable pattern of behavior or a stable personality trait to form. You don't see that diagnosis being given till a person's at least 18, because most of us in the world of psychology understand that there's a developmental process, that things change after a person reaches maturity, reaches adulthood. And so you want to give time for that pattern to level out. But now when it comes to gender dysphoria, we have a whole different take. You have an observation period that's less than other diagnoses. You have an observation period that's the same for adults as it would be for minors. So you have a number of inconsistencies with the diagnosis itself. And I want to highlight a few more with the next slide. And I haven't put all the criteria here, but I do want to just point out a few things that are a bit disconcerting when you think about how a child could get this diagnosis. So keeping that in mind as I'm reviewing some of these points. So when a child presents for therapy, they're gonna have a therapist thinking through these criteria. And I'll just point out how about half of them arguably could fit the stereotypical sex role that in a given culture, right? So if you look at the second one, does the child have a strong preference for the toys, games, or activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender? You know, I've been to parts of Africa where a child will take a Coke can and make a toy out of it. Some of these criteria seem questionable. Now, again, they're taken as a whole, but I would argue that even the criteria itself lends itself to a further investigation of what's really going on with the child. What are the underlying causes of some of what's being observed based on this criteria? For example, we can skip down to the bottom of the slide where it says, does the child have, or the child identifies with a strong dislike of one's sexual anatomy. Now, having worked in the field of foster care and having worked with people who've been sexually abused, one of the things that's very common is that a person, or in particular a child, will have a strong dislike for parts of their anatomy, especially parts of their anatomy that made them vulnerable to be abused. So again, about half of these criteria could be argued for other issues going on. That's not to say that gender dysphoria isn't real or that the experience or pain of it isn't real. It is absolutely painful. Like some of these folks are going through very difficult, painful experiences, as you'll see as we go on. But what I am saying is that there are some things listed in this criteria that necessitate further investigation, and that is not happening in either the research community or the psychological community when it comes to the root causes of gender dysphoria. Okay, next slide, please. And so what I'd like to do is just highlight how this criteria might manifest in a child. And this is actually a real case, a real person that I have permission to share a little bit about their story. And this is the story of a 9-year-old boy who ended up in a gender clinic. He was having symptoms of gender dysphoria, but he also had a pre-existing diagnosis of autism. Now, it's important to know that autism is one of the diagnoses that's often comorbid or alongside a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So this child comes to the gender clinic, or goes to the gender clinic. He is, the autism diagnosis is recognized by the clinic, but he's also given a new diagnosis really upon the first moment of treatment. And that diagnosis is gender dysphoria, and he's identified as a female lesbian. So this is a 9-year-old boy who's told, you are a female lesbian. And based on the therapist's case notes, there's a few other things that are important for us to parse out here. One is that the mother is diagnosed or has some issues, symptoms of OCD, that's obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, there are some genetic attributes of that disorder. And when it comes to the child, he's also presenting with some similar symptoms. He has some obsessions, some ruminations about his underwear. He's constantly thinking about it. It's part of the treatment plan, but it's never ruled out as a problem that could be contributing or something that should be treated in the treatment context. Now, another important thing that the child says is that he doesn't know the difference between what is real and what is not real. But again, that is not explored from what I could see in the treatment notes. What I do see is that the therapist's treatment plan includes immediately, well, I'd say not immediately, but within weeks, there's a plan to socially transition this child and to educate him on the gender transition procedures. So within weeks, he's told about puberty blockers, he's told about cross-sex hormones with his mother, and feminizing surgeries. Okay. Next slide, please. So when we look at those first three ethical principles that I talked about that are part of the Belmont Code, they were part of the National Research Act. You know, these are things that have legal bearings to them. We see that the first point, respect, to me, is violated because we have a situation where informed consent cannot truly be given by a 9-year-old boy. We know from our own government's research, there's a huge ongoing NIH study that's looked at over 12,000 developing brains and ascertained that brain development continues until a person is in their mid-20s. And what's important about that is that the neurological structures that are most significant for mental health, including the limbic system, aka the seat of our emotions, is still developing until a person's in their 20s. That's not the case for everyone, but in most cases, there's still a significant amount of development going on with structures that are responsible for our learning, our emotions, our ability to process emotions, as well as our memory. So how then can informed consent truly happen in this scenario? And incidentally, that's recognized in other disorders that are presented in the DSM, but not in the case of gender dysphoria. So again, we have other conditions that necessitate that brain development does indeed happen. But when it comes to gender dysphoria, a whole other set of rules and principles are enacted. Next slide, please. Our next violation has to do with beneficence, right? So doing no harm, that underscores the idea of doing no harm. We're magnifying the benefits and minimizing the risks. In this case, we know that there is no clear etiology, or there's no clear understanding of the root causes of gender dysphoria. But what we do have is a clear understanding of those who are presenting with these gender dysphoric symptoms have a lot of comorbidities that appear over and over again. So in the case of this 9-year-old boy, we know he's autistic. Autistic children tend to fixate on various ideas. We know he's also has a family history of OCD and that he's presenting with ruminations and obsessions, which could easily be obsessions about gender dysphoria. But again, that's not ruled out of this case. We also know that trauma history is a significant player in those who are presenting with gender dysphoria issues. As you can see, this is actually a study presented by a transgender, an LGBT advocacy group. And you can see from their study that 45% of those who identify as transgender report childhood sexual abuse. And then you look and see 75% of these folks have suffered childhood emotional trauma. And you can see more of these stats. Other places you can refer to some of my papers that I've written on this as well. So in essence, we're doing these folks a real disservice, and we're not treating the real issues. So we're actually not acting in an ethical way when we know that there are other conditions going on, but those conditions have been ignored in the face of keep towing the line for the transgender ideology. Okay, next slide, please. And the last principle that we see violated is what is referred to as justice, and particularly when it comes to exploitations, issues of exploitation. In fact, Mary has a great website. I would actually say look at her website. She has all kinds of wonderful resources, and I think she has the gender mapper on there. And you can see over the years, I think it was, I don't know if it was 10 years ago, there were just a handful of clinics that were gender clinics that were available across the country. And now you have hundreds of gender clinics that are popping up all over. And you can easily follow the money. There's a lot of evidence that shows that doctors and gender clinics are going after children on social media. And we can also see from this little slide that the surgical market is expected to grow by 14%. So we have a financial reason for the exploitation of children, which again is another ethical violation. So my charge is to you today is please fight for children and fight for good ethics and fight for these root causes to be understood and also treated, that children who are hurting would not continue to hurt by these bad practices.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing that. And it's just really concerning, I think. I appreciate you bringing the principal perspective of here are the things that we expect, just basic ethics out of the scientific community and out of physicians when they're treating children who are struggling. And here's just all of the ways that our kids are being hurt. You know, that's why here at Family Policy Alliance, we launched our Help Not Harm campaign. That's why this is called the Help Not Harm Summit, because kids who are struggling deserve help, not the harm that Jennifer just outlined and that we've been hearing about throughout the day today. So I just really appreciate you shedding light on that. You know, we just have a couple of minutes left to talk with all of us. And I just wanted to ask each of you to share how would you talk to a friend about this issue who disagreed? So Mary, maybe that's someone who says, no, I see people breaking sex stereotypes all the time. How does that line up with what you just shared? Maybe you can address that first.
Sure. I think one of the key things is to emphasize the harm point, because one of the things that has become very apparent over the past few years is that when children are put on this path of first a psychosocial transition, that they almost inevitably continue on towards medical transition. And it's harmful. It destroys the body. It destroys their fertility. In many cases, it destroys their sexual function later on. And there are just huge implications for the health of the person. So what's happening in the culture is that people hear and don't critically think about the idea that a woman can identify as a man and we treat her as a man, and sex cannot change. So I think that's one of the first things, sex cannot change. So if sex cannot change, why are we holding out to our children this mirage that says that they can spend the rest of their life trying to approximate an appearance that is either the opposite sex or something in between? They're really just declaring war on their body in a very physical way, and this has harm. So in my own experience, I've found that showing people the real statistics, not the airbrushed ones, particularly the idea that suicide risk does not decrease by going down the path of transition, either social or medical and surgical transition. And in fact, the suicide occurs at all stages of transition, after hormone surgery, after hormones and genital surgery. So this is not helpful. This hurts, and we want to help and not harm.
That's exactly right. Jennifer, my question for you is, given your scientific background and everything you were just talking about, we hear the phrase a lot that's very well meant to say, let's follow the science. But how would you address someone who says, well, I just want to follow the science on this, and clearly the scientific community, the medical community is getting behind kids going through transgender interventions? So how would you just respond briefly to someone who said that?
Yeah, the science is very weak. And this is probably a longer conversation. I'm actually writing a piece right now about follow the science. But the science is actually very weak. There aren't a lot of large-scale studies, and then there isn't a lot of clear definition about who is committing suicide based on what portion of the transition aspect that they went through. There also isn't a lot of discussion about what are the experiences of those who detransition. And to involve someone in this level of an intervention without good science behind it, without a large body, without a body of science that's been critiqued well, and from those who have no skin in the game, so to speak, is very dangerous, in my opinion.
Well, thank you both for sharing your wise words. I think our audience is finding this really helpful. And I encourage you all to just keep commenting, keep asking your questions. Like I said, our team is responding in the chat as we can, and we're storing away these questions to answer in future communications from Family Policy Alliance. I really want to thank both of our guests so much for coming and just sharing their valuable insights. And I want to encourage you, if you got fired up today, if you said this is wrong and this should not be happening to children, go ahead and sign our Help Not Harm petition. We'll put that link in the comments. If you haven't signed that already, if you have signed it, send it along to friends and demand that we protect children now. Kids who are struggling deserve help, not harm, as both of our guests articulated so well today. We'll see you all in a few minutes. We have a session coming up just for parents who are personally affected by this. So if you're personally affected by this, or you want to head off your child may be facing these concerns, come to our next session. We'll be talking about that with a couple of experts. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all in a few minutes.
Thank you.